So I wanted to make a quick video on my insight as to why radical leftists like to always proclaim IQ doesn't matter, IQ doesn't matter, IQ doesn't matter, you can't prove IQ differences, IQ difference, variance in IQ is not hereditable, blah 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 blah. IQ is like 80% hereditable according to scientific research. Okay, legitimate scientific research. Brain size correlates directly to intelligence, and the distributions of IQ are prevalent in certain populations, regardless of where they're living, regardless of the predominant culture they live in. They still have the same intelligence of the population they originally came from, or damn close, regardless of how many generations of separation there are between them and their original population. Now, why do radical leftists or egalitarians care so damned much about IQ? It's because that's how they value people. They consider themselves the intelligentsia. We're intelligent and everybody else is stupid and blah, 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 blah. Now, when I was a child, my IQ was recorded in like the high 150s. And I haven't had an IQ test since I was a young child. The highest I've been able to get on the computer tests, like the tests that you take on the computer, which everybody says not to go by, are like 125, up to like 135, okay? So I'm not stupid by any stretch of the imagination, but I also don't really care too much about IQ. And like I said in a previous video, I don't judge people by their IQ. You know, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to impress me. I'm just as impressed, if not more so impressed, by the boxer, by the farmer, by the mechanic. There are other people that have just as valid and perhaps more valid views on the way things operate than the ridiculously high IQ'd. Okay, and that's something that I find so odd about everybody that's so worried about, oh, well, this group has to be smarter than this group and that group. Everybody's so smart and you can educate away stupidity. If IQ is so environmentally based, why does it matter? Couldn't you just educate everybody into being intelligent? Couldn't you just educate away people's stupidity? No, you can't. And the thing is, there's a difference between being lower IQ'd and being stupid. I really do believe that. I really do believe that. There are plenty of lower IQ'd people with IQs in the low 90s that I guarantee you are smarter than some people. And I have a reason to believe this. There was a gentleman that was a friend of my father's. He was an aircraft engineer for many, many years in the U.S. Air Force. And he was an airman in Vietnam. And the guy had an IQ of, I think, 158. But goddamn was he dumb as a board. I mean, he was dumb as a board. Very intelligent when it came to things like mathematics and stuff like that, but practical living, how to understand what a good deal is when you go grocery shopping, how to do laundry, how to cook. Like, this is the dude that I was living with in the woods in Arizona. This dude was a pilot. Okay, now people that don't understand this, all pilots have to go through a survival school, right? And he was a legit pilot. I know for a fact the guy was a pilot. In fact, he was impressed. My father and him were both in Mensa. And what he was so impressed about was that my father, his flight manuals, my dad wanted to borrow his flight manuals for one night. And my father memorize pretty much all of the important details of the flight manuals, the different pressures that are necessary for different hydraulic things. I don't know or care. It's not my thing. But both my father and him were in Mensa. That wasn't how they met, but that was, they had that in common. They were both very high IQ'd people. So he would always tell me about how awesome my father was because he was so astonished that he could memorize his flight manuals. So I do know for a fact from my dad and from this dude, I know the guy was definitely a pilot. He definitely had survival training by the U.S. Air Force. When we were in the woods in Arizona, he got all freaked out because we didn't have any water. We were right next to a stream, right? So I start taking the water out of the stream and putting it through a number of, clean clothes that I had, clean shirts. And then I boiled it on the gas stove we had to make drinkable water. That's just what you do. Any imbecile knows that. I guarantee you can find a redneck in the middle of somewhere in the back country in Kentucky that will tell you that that's what you do to make clean water. This dude who has 158 IQ, he don't grasp that. He don't know how to make clean water out of dirty water. Okay? So my point is that it's IQ is relative. And the other thing is, this is the one problem I see with classical liberalism that was absorbed by modern liberalism. And I'm a big fan of Francis Galton. I'm a big fan of eugenics. One of the shortcomings of eugenics is its intelligentiocentric attitudes. Its idea that IQ is the end-all, be-all of all things, and it's just not the case. What's the point of having an IQ of, 160 if you're confined to a wheelchair like Stephen Hawking? I guarantee you Stephen Hawking would have gladly given up, 50 or 60 IQ points to be able to run a marathon. Okay? And then, I mentioned how I'm a fan of Mike Tyson, okay? Mike Tyson was a genius when it came to boxing. I guarantee you he's not the smartest guy in the room if he goes to NASA. But that doesn't make him less of a person. And that's the thing, is that the way that the radical left views things is because they consider themselves the intelligentsia. They consider everyone that's slow-witted, which is what they would consider, or I should say this differently. They consider everybody with an IQ that isn't over 130. I'm just throwing out a number. Anybody with an IQ that isn't over 130, they consider them to be slow-witted, when really, they're just very arrogant people that really are overestimating their own intelligence and have a limited perspective of the world. Okay? Now, the one dude that commented on my video was explaining how it's unfair to consider the IQ of... Now, remind you, this is the thing. This is the problem these people have, is they equate IQ with humanness, with humanity. Okay? There's more to being a human than intelligence. Okay? That's what people aren't grasping. Okay, so this dude, he makes a video about how it's unfair. I'm going to leave a link to the video. It's unfair to compare people of sub-Saharan African descent to Europeans in IQ comparisons because of the difference in the environment. Well, the fact of the matter is, as I noted earlier in this video, people of sub-Saharan African descent, whether they live in sub-Saharan Africa, or the United States, or Great Britain, or, let's say, Egypt, or Saudi Arabia, or South America, they generally have the same basic score on IQ. Okay? This isn't a negative thing, it's just a fact. IQ is, generally speaking, genetic. It's mostly a genetic thing. This doesn't mean that they're less of a person because they might have a lower IQ, or that they're not gifted in other ways. This is why I believe that IQ tests are greatly limited in their ability to measure actual aptitude, total aptitude. Okay? I believe in the multiple intelligence theory. I don't believe IQ is the end-all be-all at saying what somebody is worth. I think it's the most effective psychometric test of somebody's ability to achieve scholastically. But what does that really mean in real life? As I explained, the dude that I was in Arizona with that had 158 IQ, I think is what he told me, and I don't doubt it. I know he was very intelligent, but let's say this. So he scholastically achieved quite a bit. He was absolutely shocked that I could make clean water out of dirty water. Okay, so I'm assuming he grasped in the Air Force Academy how to do that, how to make clean water out of dirty water. But what if he crashed in Vietnam? What if he had to implement that in the field and couldn't do it? Intellectually, he probably understood that back in the day, but could he implement it in real life? Probably not. Probably not. And that's the biggest issue, is there's multiple aptitudes. Okay, understanding something intellectually and applying it in reality are two different things. And the more and IQ tests have gotten worse, in the sense that when I was a kid, I had a couple IQ tests when I was a kid. One of them had to do with when I was in one of the psych units I was in. They had to give you an IQ test to prove, not what it is, they give you an IQ test before you're medicated, and an IQ test after you're medicated, to make sure that the medicine isn't making you stupid. Like it's not affecting your ability to cognitively function like a normal person, because there are many people, like I've pointed out, that are so heavily medicated that they appear indistinguishable from people that are mentally challenged. That's a regular occurrence in the mental health field. Okay, so when I was a kid, I've had a bunch of IQ tests. When I was a kid, not as an adult, and my IQ was quite high. But the difference between the IQ tests then and the IQ tests now are very different. In the olden days, you used, there was a lot of dexterity testing, and the ability to use blocks to mimic patterns on paper and things like that, and this does this and that. There's a lot of mechanical reasoning. Not so much in a lot of the modern IQ tests. A lot of them take place in the brain. You're not doing things that require any aptitude or dexterity or any way to manipulate the physical world around you. And I think that it's a very inaccurate way to measure things, because just because somebody can do something in their brain does not mean that it matters in real life. It doesn't mean that they're making sense of it enough to actually do it in real life. This is one of the problems with mathematics. Now, as I've said, I'm not a big mathematics whiz. I'm not great at mathematics. But one of the follies of mathematics, this is why real scientists and real engineers pick on mathematicians, is mathematicians, a lot of what mathematicians do take place up here. What scientists do, what engineers do, what legitimate scientists do take place in physical reality, in the laboratory or in reality itself. That's not the same. That's also why a lot of these theoretical sciences
like Richard Dawkins' selfish gene. There's a lot of issues with that because it's all theoretical, it can't be proven, and it's utter nonsense in so many ways. But that's the reason, or theoretical physics, where it has no reality behind it, or psychology, where psychology, there's no basis to prove psychology. You're just saying things. Anybody can say things. And that's the problem with a lot of this stuff, is these people that consider themselves the intelligentsia, we're the intelligentsia, we know better than everybody else, blah, 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 blah. No, that's not reality. That's not reality. And then to judge people's worth, think about this. You're judging people's worth based on a standardized test. What does that really say? It says that is how shallow somebody is. What if you just had a bad day? What if you didn't sleep well? That could greatly affect your outcome on an IQ test, regardless of the fact that you have a high IQ. If you're sleeping well, or you're having a bad day and you don't have patience, it requires a lot of patience. The one, who is that gentleman that, oh my gosh, I can't believe I forget the guy's name. He's the smartest guy in the world, or the second smartest guy in the world. Like he said, I forget the guy's name. Oh my God, the hell. Oh my God, I can't believe it. He was even on a show about freaky habits. He won Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. Oh my God, I can't remember his name off the top of my head. But like he said, he's a Jewish gentleman. Like he said, if he was really as smart as, as these IQ tests show, because he takes the time to puzzle out all these questions and answers and all this, instead of doing so well on these IQ tests, he'd be a multi-billionaire. Okay? And that's the thing, is like these people, there's a big difference between being smart up here and being smart. There really is. And that's the thing, is the radical left and the egalitarians, the reason that they care so much about IQ is because that's how they judge people's worth. They don't look at any other factors. They just look at what that standardized test says. What does that number say? And that's how they judge people's worth. It's not about their ability to run quickly. It's not their ability to figure things out in reality. It's not their work ethic. It's not their ability. It's not their talent or their giftedness in any particular thing. It's just that number on that piece of paper. That's what that means. That's what that means. And I quit believing the IQ and the wealth of nations thing, simply because I don't believe it to be accurate. I do believe a lot of IQ data has been very much flawed, particularly in data collection. I think that the way data is collected is poor, but I do believe that an IQ test is a relative. I mean, really, if you're talking about psychometrics, and you're talking about physiognomy, and you're talking about the measurement of the brain size and how that correlates, that's where you start seeing the intersection of behavioral psychology and anthropology and reality. And I mean, when you see that brain size correlates to workable intelligence as measured by an IQ test, I think that everybody's concept of intelligence is very limited, and that's what I think is very interesting. And a lot of people, they like to say, oh, this is this way and that is that way. As we expand, as we evolve as a species, remember, I'm a transhumanist, and this is what people don't understand. The way we perceive reality with our limited human understanding will change the less limited our human understanding gets. So as we implement, I'm a big fan of Ray Kurzweil, and people might know who he is, they might not know who he is. But as we implement brain expanding things such as nootropics and linking up with different software, and I'm a big fan of biological science. I'm a big fan of genetic manipulation to enhance intelligence. But as we start doing these things, we are going to realize, whether it's us or our descendants, we are going to realize how ignorant we were as a species. And as our ability to understand reality expands, as our intelligence expands, we're going to realize how limited our perception of things like intelligence were, and things of that, and things like that. And I don't think that I'm exaggerating at all. I think that the mind-expanding revolution through nootropics, primarily at this point, like I should do this to the bridges, Kurzweil's bridges. But right now, even with Bridge 1 technologies, exercising and supplementation with nootropics and just physical exercise, when you do this, and you see how limited your capacity to understand was when you weren't doing these things. Your IQ might not change 1 point, but your insight does drastically. And that's what I think is important to understand. IQ does not necessarily correlate to insight. IQ does not correlate to wisdom. IQ doesn't necessarily correlate to real-world aptitude, as I showed with that dude that I was stuck in the woods with, unfortunately. There was a complete moron with 158 IQ. And that's all for this video. Please check the links in the description.